of the old Galway jails that had closed down in 1939. And they even built the cathedral behind the old jail walls, using the walls as their hoarding. And also the bridge that connects to the cathedral, that's now called the Salmon Weir Bridge. It was originally called the jail bridge because they had to construct it to stop prisoners from escaping, as some of those prisoners had been getting away by jumping into the river and swimming away with the current when they were trying to bring them over in boats from the courthouses, which are on the east bank, over to the jails on the west bank. And coming up on that west bank there now on our left, and for much of the way up the river today, we have the sprawling campus of the University of Galway, and it was opened in 1849 as one of Queen Victoria's colleges. And construction work started in 1845, which was the middle of the famine, so building the university and also the Eglinton Canal at the same time gave some desperately needed famine relief jobs. And when it opened its doors, there were just 68 students here. And if you look between the two tall modern buildings there on the left, you can spot the tower of the first building in the university. And the tower is now the symbol of the university. And it's on the quadrangle building. And the design of that was based on one of the main buildings over at the University of Oxford called Christ Church College. And the university has expanded greatly now. There are about 19,000 students attending here. And the town of Galway itself was founded in the 13th century by a Norman family called the de Burgos on the site of a much older settlement that was already here. And the de Burgos picked this spot for their town mainly because the River Corrib was here. The river provided an endless source of clean, fresh water, a source of food with fish, and it surrounded Galway on three sides, so Galway was a very easy place to defend from attacks. And then where the River Bay meet was an excellent harbour for their sailing boats. So it rapidly expanded and became the third most important port in the British Isles after London and Bristol during the height of its prosperity in the Middle Ages. And that's when what we call the famous 14 tribes of Galway, who were actually wealthy merchant families, that's when they reached their peak. But then the town fell into a period of decline, and there were great fires which destroyed much of the timber buildings, so they had to rebuild out of stone. The Black Death Plague then struck here twice, reducing population numbers, and finally the potato famine was devastating to Galway in the 19th century. So it's only really since the 60s that Galway has had a chance to recover again. And the name Galway comes from its Irish name Galliv, from two Irish words Gal and Av, and together they mean a stony riverbed, and it probably refers to the bottom of the River Corrib below us now, which is very rocky. And we're about to pass under the Quincentenary Bridge, and it was built to celebrate Galway being 500 years a city. But even though it was built back in 1984, everyone in Galway still calls this the new bridge, or here on board the Car Princess, for obvious reasons we call it the Lough Bridge. And the little mural on one of the pillars there to the right was done to celebrate those two local women winning bronze medals and rowing at the Tokyo Olympics. And if you look to the right about there now, immediately after the bridge, you'll see the ruins of Terrylands Castle, but it's known locally as Old Castle because it is so old. It was built there by the de Burgo family way back in 1484. And the de Burgos built their castle here about a half a mile outside the town walls of Galway because there was a natural ford or crossing of the river around about where the new bridge is there today. And so the castle was built to defend the crossing. And there would have been a huge ring wall around it, and down along the river's edge with only one gate that allowed you access to that ford. But the most famous story about the castle is the story of the O'Flaherty. Like see now Game of Thrones, they put the trapdoor under his chair, and prison guards dragged him off through a secret tunnel where he was then beheaded. They put his head in a sack, and the soldiers rowed back into Galway, across the river to ford the Cheyland, and through the sack over the walls of the castle onto the courtyard, with a note on the outside that said, "This is the O'Flaherty's rent here with interest." And the de Burgos later carved a sign into the stone above the gates of Galway that said, "God protect us from atrocious O'Flahertys." And my mother was an O'Flaherty on an arm, and that was his own name. 1480s, found an unusually large number of Bronze Age axeheads and spearheads on the island, but it announced there was some sort of Bronze Age weapons workshop there. But it was also at this point the river just directly below us now that I was diving a few years ago when I saw what I call one of those Bronze Age spearheads. The one I come across turned out to be from much earlier, and it was actually from the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, which in Ireland extended from about 8000 BC to 4000 BC. And this makes the spearhead one of the oldest man-made objects ever found in Galway, in Ireland in fact. And the spearhead was sent to the National Museum of Arms in Dublin, where it was confirmed and identified, and then it was returned to the Galway City Museum where it's put on display. And she dates it back to about 5500 BC, and this shows that people have been living by using this carved here for the last 7,500 years or so. And ahead of us to the left there, where the tall trees are now, is where a building called Dangan House would have been standing, and it was the family home of the Martins, and they were a very wealthy landlord family and one of the 14 tribes. But after living there for centuries, when the Martins eventually left Dangan House, the building was turned into a nunnery, and a few years later, fire broke out and destroyed much of the house, and what remained then was completely demolished to make way for the tracks of the Galway-Clifton railway line. But all that really remains of the original Martin estate is that small church-like building to the left there, and it was a folly on the Martins estate, but it's now called the Tea House, because there was a tradition in Galway in the last century that people would row up the Corrib here on a Sunday in large numbers and stop at the tea house to have their picnics, and that tradition was called maying. But the most famous member of the Martins to have lived in Dangan House was Sir Richard Martin, and he was better known as Humanity Dick because of his kindness to animals, and he was a founding member of the first humane society in the world, the RSPCA, or Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And when people would ask Sir Richard why he preferred animals to humans, he would reply, because an ox cannot hold a gun. However, he was very fond of guns himself because he's always getting into duels with pistols, and it's said that he shot several people, especially those who he thought were cruel to animals. And coming up on the right there now is Menlo Castle, and it was built here first by the Blake family in 1480, and the first part of their castle is the part to the right there. It's just behind the trees at the moment. It was a defensive Norman tower house and has really thick walls, and it would have had small windows.
Yeah, because they
but
won't
then
show
in
the castle.
peacetime, they broke through and increased the size of those windows, and they built the 4-storey extension to the left there to turn this into a Georgian mansion. And the separate building behind the castle was an accommodation block with a large door and that where they used to get horse carriages in and out of that building. But unfortunately, like Dangan House in the opposite bank, Menlo Castle here caught fire as well, and this time was on the 26th of July in the year 1910, and until the 1970s there was a huge mystery about what exactly happened on the night of the fire. And it was then that the only survivor read an article about the mystery surrounding the fire, and she wrote back to the local author and historian here in Galway, Maurice Semple, to tell Maurice what actually had happened. On the night there were only 3 people in the castle, as Lord and Lady Blake and the majority of the servants were away in Dublin because Lord Blake was about to undergo a cataract operation. Ellen Blake, who was their only daughter, was the only member of the Blake family in the castle. And Ellen had a lot of medical difficulties throughout her life, and as a result she was hard to care for, and she was also 45, while the poor servant girl that they'd left to look after her, Anne, was only 16. So when Anne tried to place a lit oil lamp in Ellen's room, as she'd been told to do so by Lord Blake, Ellen totally objected and took the oil lamp herself. Anne Brown and Delia Early was the cook, then went to bed in the attic shortly afterwards. And it was Anne who first realised that the castle was on fire. When she woke up, she could smell the smoke, so she tried to wake Delia as well, but Delia ignored her and told her to go back to bed because they had to get up at 4:30 a.m. every morning to do their chores. But Anne decided to check to make sure, so she went over and opened the bedroom door, and just as she did so, the whole staircase started to collapse down in front of her. So the 2 girls had no choice then but to climb out onto the attic roof, and their shouts brought some local men who carried over blankets and hay to try and catch the girls, but unfortunately, however, they did catch Anne, but she'd broken her back to fall, and when she woke up later, they were using an old door as a stretcher to bring her over to a horse cart for the bumpy ride into the infirmary in Galway, and she spent 5 months there before her back had fully healed, and another year recuperating with friends of hers on the street of Overmore in Galway. And the newspaper at the time mistakenly reported that she too had died in fire, and that's part of the reason the mystery surrounding it started. but she actually emigrated to the US and lived till old age in New York City. And the Blakes, heartbroken at the loss of their only daughter, decided never to restore Menlo Castle, and instead they moved forever to their estates over in England.
You didn't know that?
But the most famous member of the Blake family to have owned Menlo Castle over the centuries was Valentine Blake, and he was the grandfather of Ellen Blake that accidentally started the fire at Menlo. And Valentine loved to buy things, but he only paid for half of it. He owed an awful lot of money, and more importantly, an awful lot of taxes, so eventually there was a warrant issued for his arrest. But in those days, they cannot arrest you on a Sunday, so every Sunday Valentine would head off down to the clubhouse near Square, and he would wine and dine there until almost midnight. He'd then hop on his horse and start heading back towards Menlo Castle. And the police would often be waiting for him along the way in their horses, and they would chase after him, and then all the locals would come out to watch. So this became known as the Menlo Races. But Valentine. And to the left there up on the hill is a large building, and it's called Glenlow Abbey, and it was once the home of the Frenches, a very religious Norman family and one of the 14 tribes. But it's now a 5-star hotel with a 9-hole golf course. And to the left of the hotel is the original French family home and the steeple of a small chapel they built onto their home. And to the right and a little below it there are a couple of railway carriages, and those are Pullman carriages, and those particular ones used to operate between Paris and St. Petersburg, but then they were brought to the UK and they were used in the 1974 movie Murder on the Orient Express. And also when Winston Churchill's remains were brought on a tour of the UK by train back to his home place for burial, the carriages were part of that train, and they're brought here in a bad state, restored by the hotel, and are now used as one of their restaurants. And they have a railway themed restaurant as a nod to the fact that the Galway Clifton Railway line used to pass through what is now the middle of the hotel golf course. And to our left up on the hill, or sorry, to the left also is where the river splits in two, and the part heading off to the left there is the natural course of the river, and you can continue on up that side for another 4 kilometres or 2.5 miles to the lake, but it's too shallow for this boat in a couple of spots. So the route we are taking now instead is a man-made channel called the Friar's Cut, and it got the name because it was originally made when Franciscan monks decided to cut a channel through the bog as a shortcut to the lake. And the idea was to shorten the journey from their abbey in Clare Galway to their new abbey down at Whoopee. And originally it was very narrow, only wide enough to pull a rowing boat after you, so it walks down back to nature. And the whole of the Corrib is European Special Area Conservation, a bird sanctuary, and also a UNESCO wetland of international importance, so there's plenty of wildlife around here. And the reeds that grow along the banks of the river are the common reed, but the Latin name for them is Phragmites australis, and they're native in Ireland and all over Europe, but they are an invasive species in North America and causing problems over there at the moment. But they're harvested here every year between the months of March and April, just before they start to grow again, because it is this type of reed that they use for making the roofs of traditional thatched cottages in Ireland. Thatched cottages? Thatched cottages. Okay, I missed that. Thank you. Way ahead of us in the distance there's a small hill, and that's called Knockma, and it's near the town of Tuam in County Galway. And there are 3 large cairns or burial mounds on top of the hill from the Mesolithic. And archaeologists think that they were once as impressive as the most famous examples of cairns that we have in Ireland, which are located at Newgrange in Louth in County Meath. But unfortunately the Kerwin family, who were one of the 14 tribes of Galway, they took a lot of the stone from those cairns to build their castle at the base of the hill, so very little of them remain. However, the legends around them have survived, and one was supposed to be in the tomb of Finbarra, who was meant to be king of the Connacht fairies in Irish mythology, and fairies in Irish mythology were like elves from Lord of the Rings. And another one was supposed to be in the burial place of another legendary figure, Queen Maeve of Connacht. And some say that Knockma means Hill of Maeve, but it's more likely it means Hill of the Plains, as it's all flat farmland around the hill. And we are now on Lough Corrib, and Lough Corrib is the largest lake in the Republic of Ireland and the second largest lake on the island. The largest is Lough Neagh in Northern Ireland. The lake covers 176 square kilometres or 70 square miles, and it has 3 main parts. Everything you can see ahead of us is just the lower lake, and this part is shallow with an average depth of only 7 feet and a deepest point of just 20 feet. And if you look into the water, you should be able to see the bottom of the lake most of the way up. However, the upper lake is much deeper with a deepest point of 160 feet, and it's about 3 times the size of the lower lake here in area. And then there is a 12-mile stretch in between the two, which is the middle lake, but it's not as wide as the other 2 parts, so it's locally called the Narrows. And it's very shallow there in places. They had to dig out that channel through that part of the lake during the famine to make room for steamboats to get from the lower lake here up to the upper lake. And they control the wash level on the lake down at the Salmon Weir, and that's near where we left from today. And there's 16 gates and all at that weir that they can open one by one, depending on the level of water required. And during